She has worked at the Baltimore City Detention Center for 3 years. She knows every corridor, every gate, every camera angle, every blind spot. She knows which supervisors check the monitors and which ones don't. She knows which shifts are lightest. She knows the specific sound the door makes on Tier 4 when it opens from the outside versus the inside. 3 years. She has seen men come in terrified and leave broken. She has seen men come in broken and leave more dangerous than when they arrived. She has watched what this place does to people. She has never been affected by any of it until him. She is in the locker room now. End of shift. She should be going home. Instead, she is standing in front of a mirror, doing something she has never done in this building before. Checking her makeup, she smooths her uniform, fixes her hair, looks at herself for a long moment. Then, she does something that will end her career, her freedom, and the life she has spent 3 years building. She turns off the camera covering the corridor on Tier 4 and walks toward his cell. She will be in there for almost an hour. Across the city at this exact moment, another woman is getting ready. Not for work, not for a date, not for anything she could explain to the people in her life without watching their faces change. She is getting ready to go to the jail. She has been thinking about him all day. She thought about him while she was making breakfast. She thought about him while she was driving. She has been carrying him around in her mind like something she cannot put down, and she does not fully understand when that started or how it got this far. She checks her makeup in the rearview mirror before she goes inside. She is also a correctional officer at the Baltimore City Detention Center. She is also carrying his child. 2 women, 2 mirrors. The same man. His name was Tavon White. Street name, Bulldog. And by the time federal agents finally moved on the Baltimore City Detention Center, he had done what no gang leader, no criminal organization, no external threat had ever managed to do. He had made the jail work for him. 4 correctional officers were pregnant with his children. 2 of them had his name tattooed on their own bodies. He had bought them luxury cars with prepaid debit cards sent by text message from inside a cell. He ran a criminal organization from behind bars so effectively that the people assigned to stop him were the ones making it possible. And on one wiretapped phone call, played in open court by federal prosecutors, he said something that turned out to be not a boast, but an accurate operational assessment. This is my jail. I make every final call in this jail. He was not wrong. This is the story of how Tavon White walked into a Baltimore detention facility on an attempted murder charge and turned it into his own private kingdom. Before you understand what Tavon White built inside the Baltimore City Detention Center, you have to understand the specific conditions that made it possible. BCDC was not a prison. It was a pretrial detention facility. The place where people wait while their cases move through the court system. That distinction matters more than most people realize because pretrial facilities operate on a fundamentally different rhythm than long-term prisons. The population turns over constantly. People come in, make bail, go home. Others wait months, sometimes years, for trial. Staff and inmates develop relationships over time in ways that long-term correctional institutions are better equipped to monitor and interrupt. More than 60% of BCDC's correctional officer workforce was female. Many were young. Many were underpaid, starting salaries in the low 30s, doing one of the most stressful jobs in the American corrections system. 12-hour shifts, constant exposure to violence, desperation, and a specific kind of human suffering that most people never encounter. Supervisors who were stretched thin, a culture that asked a great deal and offered very little in return. The Black Guerrilla Family had roots at BCDC going back decades. Founded in California in the 1960s inside San Quentin by men who had spent years studying power and organization from inside correctional institutions, BGF had spread through the country's jail and prison network over time. By the time Tavon White arrived, BGF had the kind of institutional presence inside BCDC that most legitimate organizations spend decades building on the outside. Structure, hierarchy, revenue streams, communication networks, enforcement mechanisms, a culture within the culture. Into that world, Tavon White arrived on an attempted murder charge, and within months, BGF at BCDC had a new commander. What made Tavon White different from the BGF leaders who came before him was not his violence or his rank or his street reputation. It was what he understood about the women around him. He studied them the way a businessman studies a market. He paid attention. He listened. He remembered details, birthdays, problems, the specific frustrations that a woman working 12-hour shifts in a detention facility carries around with her and almost never gets to put down. He was charming in the specific way that feels personal rather than performed. He made women who processed hundreds of inmates per shift feel like they were the only person in the room. He identified who was struggling financially, who was lonely, who had come to a job that was supposed to be temporary and found themselves still there 3 years later, wondering how it happened. He understood the gap between what these women had been promised by their lives and what those lives had actually delivered, and he filled it. One by one, he built relationships, not casual connections, not transactional arrangements that both parties understood for what they were. Deep relationships, the kind that made women who had sworn an oath to the state of Maryland start making decisions that served Tavon White instead. They fell in love with him, not all of them in the same way, but genuinely, completely, in ways that overrode their professional training and their self-interest and their understanding of what this relationship would cost them if it came to light. 4 of them had his children. 1 had his child twice. 2 of them loved him enough to have his name permanently tattooed on their own bodies. 1 had Tavon tattooed on her neck. Another had Tavon tattooed on her wrist. Think about what that means. A woman employed by the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, trained, badged, authorized to use force if necessary, choosing to mark her own body with the name of the man she was assigned to supervise. That is not a transaction. That is devotion. And devotion, Tavon White understood, was the most valuable asset a man in his position could possibly acquire. The relationships were the foundation. What White built on top of them was an operation. Cell phones, the single most important contraband item in White's entire enterprise, the device that made everything else possible. Without a phone, he was an inmate in a cell. With a phone, he was a commander with access to his entire organization, the streets of Baltimore, and every woman whose loyalty he had spent months carefully building. The women carried phones in. They carried other contraband too, items that moved through the facility's distribution network and generated revenue for BGF. They knew which shifts were lightest. They knew which supervisors looked the other way. They knew the camera blind spots on every tier because they had worked those tiers for years. They tipped him off to shakedowns before they happened. One of his guards, 8 months pregnant with his child, sent him a message warning him that a search was coming that night. He got back on the phone immediately. "Let me call all these dudes in my phone and let them know. An inmate in a pre-trial detention facility on an attempted murder charge. running an early warning system for his entire organization, using a phone that should not have existed in that building, tipped off by a guard who was carrying his baby. That was not a corrupt employee. That was a soldier. The BGF operation inside BCDC was not a gang running contraband on the side. It was a vertically integrated criminal enterprise headquartered inside a government-run detention facility. White and his BGF associates used prepaid, reloadable debit cards loaded with cash on the outside, the PIN numbers sent by text message to pay for everything the operation required. Contraband, gifts, luxury cars for the correctional officers who worked for them. Not used cars, not cheap gifts. Luxury cars. BGF members inside paid dues. Other inmates operating inside BCDC were taxed. If you were running anything inside that facility, a percentage went to the organization that controlled it. You could not operate without White's permission. And White's permission came with a price. The revenue-funded operations on the streets of Baltimore. White directed BGF activity outside the jail from inside it. Distribution, enforcement, business decisions about the organization's operations across the city. All of it flowing through a man in a cell who should have had no communication with the outside world at all. He had more operational control over BGF's Baltimore operations from inside BCDC than most gang leaders have from the street, because he had something most gang leaders don't. A staff. Women who loved him enough to turn off cameras, to carry phones past security, to text him warning messages 8 months pregnant, to tattoo his name on their own bodies. There is a phone call in the federal wiretap record that tells you everything about how Tavon White saw himself and his situation. Not a boast, not performance. A statement of operational fact delivered with the specific calm of a man who has assessed his position accurately and is simply describing what he sees. This is my jail, he said it plainly. I make every final call in this jail. He was not wrong. The Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services had fired 54 employees at BCDC in the years before the federal indictment. 54. And the operation continued. The BGF flag, as the FBI would later put it, continued to fly over the Baltimore City Detention Center. Because firing individual officers did not address what Tavon White had actually built. The structure remained. The relationships remained. The specific understanding that the man on tier had more to offer than the state did, and that the consequences he could deliver were more immediate than anything the institution could threaten. That remained. It took a federal task force assembled specifically to address corruption at Maryland correctional facilities. 2 years of work. Wiretaps tracking every phone call. Financial records mapping every debit card transaction. Surveillance documenting what the institution's own internal processes had failed to stop. And when they finally moved, they brought agents in from outside Baltimore because they could not trust the people already inside not to tip White off first. 44 defendants named. 24 of them were the people paid to guard the jail. The indictment described in specific detail what White had built, the contraband pipeline, the financial system, the BGF command structure operating openly inside a government facility, and the relationships with staff that had turned the people responsible for security into assets of the organization they were supposed to contain. Tavon White pleaded guilty. 1 count of racketeering. He admitted to commanding BGF at BCDC. He admitted to the contraband operation. He admitted to the relationships. He admitted to fathering 5 children with 4 correctional officers while incarcerated on an attempted murder charge. Then he did what commanders do when the operation is over and survival becomes the only objective. He became the government's primary witness against the people who had worked for him. The man who had said, "This is my jail," sitting in a federal courtroom, testifying against the women who had loved him enough to tattoo his name on their own bodies. His cooperation earned him 12 years on the federal racketeering charge. Combined with his original attempted murder case, 20 years total. 40 of the 44 defendants were convicted, 24 correctional officers, the women who had checked their makeup before walking to his cell, who had lain awake at night thinking about a man in a jail cell, who had carried his children and carved his name into their own skin, convicted. The Baltimore City Detention Center did not survive what Tavon White had done to it. The facility was closed, demolished. The building where 5 children had been conceived, where 2 women had tattooed his name on their own bodies, where a guard 8 months pregnant had turned off a camera and fixed her hair before walking to his cell, where he had received a warning text about a shakedown and immediately called everyone in his phone. Gone. Torn down. The state of Maryland built something new in its place, but what Tavon White built inside those walls lasted longer than the walls themselves. Tavon White, Bulldog, an inmate on a pre-trial attempted murder charge, who studied the women around him the way a businessman studies a market, who built relationships so deep that 2 of them marked their own bodies with his name, who got 4 of them pregnant from inside a cell, who bought them luxury cars with prepaid debit cards, who said on a wiretapped phone call, "This is my jail. I make every final call in this jail," who was right, who got 20 years, whose jail was demolished, and whose story is still being told.